Recently, I made a video where I explained all the versions of Tails that have popped up in Friday Night Funkin', and people wanted me to do that video, but for Sonic.exe. So today I'm going to give you the backstory of Sonic.exe, of course, and then show you each character that has kind of been influenced by him that also popped into Friday Night Funkin', and a lot of them have really dark and kind of sad backstories, so just a fair warning. Now let's start off with the backstory for Sonic.exe. Most of you probably know Sonic.exe from the creepypasta, which also got turned into a video game. You may actually remember watching Markiplier play it back in the day. I know that was the first time that I was introduced to it. Don't run! There's also been a ton of animations featuring Sonic.exe that clearly show his demonic personality. Now, many people believe that Sonic.exe is a demon that is actually possessing Sonic, but that's not technically true. EXE is a completely different entity that is more similar to Fleetway Supersonic as opposed to the actual Sonic. I say this because just like Fleetway Supersonic, EXE is completely obsessed with Sonic, and also obsessed with unaliving characters and animals alike. Something that is unique about Sonic.exe is that he just wants to kill for pleasure though. It's not like he's killing because he wants to replace Sonic or because anybody has done any wrong to him. Now, people are always curious as to why Tails, Knuckles, and Dr. Robotnik are all zombified and have pieces of their bodies ripped apart. And to understand that, you have to understand the actual Sonic.exe creepypasta. Basically, the creepypasta takes place like this. There is a character named Tom who received a copy of this video game from his friend Kyle. His buddy Kyle told him to get rid of the game because he couldn't do it himself and to not play it. But since Tom was such a huge Sonic fan, he of course disregarded his friend's advice and booted up the game anyway. Now, Tom noticed something strange from the very start. The background screen was like this red, cloudy image that was super weird and ominous, and also the three playable characters are Tails, Knuckles, and Dr. Robotnik, which usually that third character would be Sonic, which was another red flag that Tom completely ignored. And it became very clear after playing with each character and going through their storyline that Sonic.exe was simply chasing these characters down and killing them. What makes it even more creepy though is that each of these storylines were attached to some type of game, as if Sonic.exe thought that they were playthings. We see this start out with Tails, where Sonic tells them that they're going to play hide and go seek, which basically just turns into Sonic chasing you down, and we assume lunging at you because the screen cuts out then and all you hear is this god-awful scream. We see this continue with each character, going over next to Knuckles, where he puts a rule on Knuckles saying you can't run. And then we see that Sonic plays this weird game of tag with Knuckles where he keeps disappearing whenever Knuckles gets close enough to touch him. And the game ends with you playing as Dr. Robotnik, where you're in this Castlevania-like castle and you are basically running through until Sonic finds you and kills you. Now, I explained the creepypasta and why these characters are dead, but that doesn't explain why they are alive and well in this Friday Night Funkin' universe battling Boyfriend. And the answer to this is actually really simple. It's because Sonic.exe uses his power to bring these characters back to life and force them to do his bidding. And this relates back to a quote that Tom said in the actual creepypasta that reads like this. This Sonic was a monster. A pure, evil, sadistic, all-powerful, nightmarish, demented monster. And all his victims, including Tails, Knuckles, Robotnik, and possibly Kyle, are just his little toys. And the game is the very gateway into his chaotic, nightmarish world and the very hell his victims are trapped in. So ultimately, the reason that Sonic.exe has so much power here and is able to bring these characters back to life is because Boyfriend and Girlfriend actually stepped into his realm, that being the video game realm. And in this universe, Sonic.exe is basically a god, like he tells us in the creepypasta. And this explains why he rips all these characters up and basically leaves them mangled zombies. Since he thinks so highly of himself, it also means that he doesn't think very highly of these other characters, meaning that tearing them apart doesn't really affect him and he doesn't really care. The next character on this list is going to be Lord X. For what we know about Lord X thus far, he is actually an extraterrestrial being originating from the space between universes, or aka the Void. And even though technically Lord X can take on any form that he wants, he has this weird fascination with Sonic the Hedgehog, which is why he looks like a monstrous version of Sonic. My theory is that this has a lot to do with Lord X's personality. He's very methodical, very intelligent, and I think he believes that if he takes on the persona of a hero, people will be more likely to trust him. And this ties in with that twisted personality that he has. He's like if you gave a very smart but demented child endless power. And in turn, he sees humans and other creatures as toys. And I mean this in a literal sense. Lord X likes to play games with his victims that are obviously rigged against them. And if they lose, Lord X will basically devour their soul and their actual bodies. I always say that Lord X is one of the scariest versions of Sonic.exe because he basically will erase you from existence, literally. Next on our list, we're going to talk about Majin Sonic, and he's basically based off a famous Easter egg that was in the Sonic CD sound test. Even though Majin Sonic was supposed to be some type of joke, he's actually one of the more creepy versions of Sonic because he has this misshapen, smiling, human-like face and no pupils at all, making him look like something out of a straight horror story. Majin Sonic was actually placed in the game as an Easter egg by a man named Masato Nishimura, and he was also the landscape designer and also the voice of the Sonic in the Sonic CD. Majin Sonic's face is actually supposed to be based off Masato's face. And a lot of people believe that since Majin Sonic is in the same mod as Sonic.exe and all these other demonic versions of Sonic, that he is also a demon. But the name Majin doesn't actually mean demon or evil spirit in this sense. It's actually the nickname for Masato. And since Masato created Majin Sonic, he went ahead and gave him his nickname. And if you activate the Easter egg code in the Sonic CD, you'll actually get this screen that just has a bunch of Majin Sonics plastered over the screen. And that's actually what the death scene is based off in the Friday Night Funkin' mod, where you're facing Majin Sonic and lose. Next up on our list, we're going to go ahead and talk about sunky.mpeg, and I really love this Sonic because he's basically a parody of Sonic.exe, and the only way that he appears is in a hidden song called Milk. And even though Sunky is kind of derpy looking, in my opinion, I think he's actually kind of cute. And I really like Sunky because it's been confirmed that he is the only version of Sonic.exe that actually means you no harm. As weird as it is, all Sunky really wants to do is dance, party, and feed you milk, which is a reference to Sunky's parody creepypasta called Sally.exe, in which basically he feeds people milk instead of murdering them. And since Sunky is kind of a joke character, his songs actually reflect that because they have a lot of references to other songs. For example, like Can I Put My Balls in Your Jaws, Shorty Like a Melody in My Head, Best Day Ever, and Endless. Next on our list, we're going to talk about Sonic.exe, and he is a character that was based off a meme in the MLG community. Sonic was created by a YouTuber called Onyx Heart back in 2010 when they made a video called How to Draw Sonic Hedgehog. It literally showed the creator drawing Sonic in this Microsoft Paint drawing software with music from the Green Hill Zone blasting in the background. Now, even though Sonic is definitely a meme, he's actually very popular in the Sonic community. He has appeared in the Sonic the Hedgehog movie when the crazy theorist showed the drawing of Sonic to try to prove that Sonic is actually real, and he also has his own game called Sonic Ball. Next up, we're going to talk about Fatal Error Sonic. Now, fun fact here is that Fatal Error's story doesn't actually start with him, but it starts with a computer AI known as Eris that was created to be one of the most, if not the most human-like AI in existence. Her creator had spent hundreds of hours on her, and she was perfect, with a personality, human-like mind, and even feelings. It was the best AI in existence. That is, until the creator had noticed she was getting curious, Iris was exploring around his PC and was doing things questionable to what she was built for. And eventually, she started crossing the lines without even knowing it. Now, this caused the creator to try to pull the plug on her because he was basically getting afraid that she was getting too smart, and he tried to delete her, but she kept resisting. But eventually she started to be torn apart by this deletion. Her code broke, she glitched, and broke immensely. Now, in the creator's rash actions, he had done something worse than just to keep her active. He actually ended up corrupting her, and this gave her even more power. And once Eris realized what the creator had done to her, she took full control of his PC, not allowing him to do anything with technology. After a full year tormenting her creator, he couldn't take it anymore, and he ended up unaliving himself, leaving Eris with full control. Time had passed, and Eris took on a new name called Fatal Prime and started hungering for more code and more data. So she basically created a series of copies of herself, simply known as Fatal Copies, to go out into other people's PC and gather code to bring back for her and to feed her. They were basically her puppets, and they did all of her bidding. That is, until one day, Fatal Prime was in the middle of producing another Fatal Copy when something went wrong. The copy was resisting, pulling off more code from Fatal Prime than it should have, and it came out a lot more mangled. This copy disgusted Eris. With Fatal Error now being created, he was a lot more sentient than the rest of the Fatal copies, and just like Eris, aka Fatal Prime, he started to question his existence, why he was created. And the only conclusion that he came to was that Fatal Prime sickened him to his core. He wanted nothing more than to see her grovel in weakness and pain. Now after a while, Fatal Error was actually sent out to gather code just like the other Fatal copies, but Fatal Prime made sure that Fatal Error could not come back because, as we said, she hated him. Fatal Error ended up finding himself in a random person's PC, and the first file that caught his attention was a Sonic 3 and Knuckles ROM. Now at first he was just going to consume the code and move on, but a spark arose in his mind. He basically wanted to have a bit of fun for himself for once. So to do this, he actually entered the game and he began to corrupt all the inhabitants, aka all the characters in the game. Now sadly, Fatal Error's first victim was Sonic, and he basically hunted Sonic down, chasing him through the launch base, and when he captured him, he basically ripped off pieces of his body and he entered his torso. And this is why in the first form of the mod, Fatal Error actually looks like a corrupted version of Sonic the Hedgehog. Fatal is basically using Sonic's body as a vessel. And if that wasn't bad enough, the rest of the characters soon followed, meaning Tails, Knuckles, Eggman, and even Metal Sonic ended up being corrupted by Fatal Error as well. And they basically got given a fate worse than death, kind of like how Sonic.exe does to his victims. Fatal basically turned them all into cold puppets, and now he controls them like a marionette. The only thing that they're able to do is whisper for help. Now the saddest part here is that even after Fatal Error corrupts all these characters, their original code still exists in the game, so it's kind of like they have a ghost form that is still wandering around the world and able to see what has happened to their true form. Sonic has it the worst out of all these characters though, because he was supposed to be like the hero of this universe, so he was really broken down with the fact that he couldn't actually save his friends. And when he finally had enough of actually seeing them being tortured, he did try to actually fight against Fatal Error, but Fatal Error actually ended up taking Sonic's original code and consuming it, basically making Sonic forever a part of himself. And to make that clear, because I know that sounds kind of weird, it's basically like Fatal Error first took Sonic's body and then he went back and took Sonic's soul. So now Sonic is completely consumed by Fatal Error. The worst part about all of this is that once Fatal Error figured out the power that he actually had and how he was able to use that, he figured that he didn't actually need Fatal Prime anymore. He understood that he has the capability to be stronger than pretty much anybody in this universe. And since Fatal Error saw how well and how easily he was able to corrupt this Sonic ROM, he went to other PCs and started corrupting even more characters. He basically set a goal for himself to not only be stronger than Fatal Prime, but to be the most dangerous EXE character, period. The next character on our list is called Devoid, aka Devoid Sonic. And he is an alternate version of Sonic that wears a mask to hide his face, and here's why. The Void story takes place during the final events of Sonic CD. Sonic had blasted through the 7 zones that made up Little Planet in an effort to stop Dr. Robotnik's latest evil plan, which involved building a huge robotic shell around the planet as well as chaining it to Earth. Sonic had made it to Robotnik's final base, which was called Metallic Madness, but unfortunately for Sonic, it was already too late. Robotnik sat there in his station mech, lifeless, as a loud, maniacal laughter filled the room and also the planet in general, it seemed. It was almost like Dr. Eggman was everywhere. The reason for this is that the strange robotic shell he had built around Little Planet wasn't just for looks. It was a mechanical body fused with the planet and built to host Dr. Robotnik's mind and soul, giving him the ability to harness the full power of the Time Stones, in turn allowing him control over time and space. Sonic tried to fight back, but his efforts were useless because Robotnik was basically invincible in his current state. Sonic had no other choice but to use the 6 Time Stones in his possessions, which he collected on his journey to Robotnik's lair. Sonic had hoped that with the Time Stones he could travel back to before Dr. Robotnik had the chance to fuse with the planet. However, given the fact that Robotnik essentially was Little Planet now, this failed catastrophically. Robotnik's will over the Time Stones won out and Sonic was erased from time. Now Sonic woke up in a void and was in an unbearable pain, surrounded by nothing but pure darkness. He could still feel himself, he still felt alive, but at the same time, he felt empty. He could still move, so he ran as fast as he could, and suddenly, Sonic was engulfed in light. His immense speed had somehow allowed him to escape the void and warp back to his timeline. However, when he arrived, everything was wrong. The pain hadn't left, he still felt empty, but he seemed to be back in his world. The short relief of being home was quickly replaced by fear as he stumbled around Green Hill, begging for help, but there was no Mobians or animals, the water evaporated, and the grass was all decayed. Sonic, for the first time in his life, was actually terrified, but then he had a spark of hope. He spotted his companion, Tails, and notably, Tails seemed to be looking around in shock as well. Sonic cried out for Tails, begging for help, and when Tails looked to see who was speaking to him, Tails was struck with fear. His mind couldn't understand what Sonic had become. Sonic didn't know it yet, but his face was basically a void, and when Tails looked into it, his body was absorbed in the void, aka into Sonic. Tails screamed in agony as he was being absorbed, and to Sonic's absolute horror, he can still hear Tails screaming inside of him. Sonic begged and pleaded with Tails to stop screaming because it's driving him insane, but Tails cannot hear him and is simply forced to suffer for all eternity. Now, over the next few years, Robotnik actually expands his power to more of the universe because no one can actually stand up to his power. But Sonic comes to understand that he is an entity that now exists outside of time's rules, and this means that Robotnik can't actually control him, and he vows to make Robotnik pay for what he's done to the universe and what he's done to him. Now, thanks to Tails, Sonic also figures out that if any living thing views him, they'll be absorbed into the black hole that makes up his non-existent face. Now Sonic wears the face of a destroyed Batnik as a mask, so no one will ever suffer the same fate as Tails unless Sonic wills it. The sad fact about this version of Sonic is that he's always on the brink of insanity now. He's very emotionally unstable and he struggles with his own identity. And this is why he takes on the name The Void. He can't stand to think of himself as Sonic anymore, and the thoughts of his old life makes him depressed and disgusted with the new life that he has. The only piece of good news here is that no matter what happens, his one goal now is to permanently destroy Robotnik, and he'll do whatever it takes to accomplish that goal. The next character on our list is going to be Needle Mouse, and she actually has a very interesting backstory. Now, from what we know about her, she was actually considered to be human at one time, and her name was Sarah. Now, Sarah had a small group of friends who were so close that they considered themselves to be family. Unfortunately, one night this group of friends were drinking and they accidentally got into a drunken brawl. It seems that Sarah's friends hurt her very badly, so they decided to dig a ditch and throw her body in it. Now, while Sarah was definitely unalive in this ditch, her spirit was still very much alive, and she was angry, and that anger was just growing and growing over time. And this basically turned her into a vengeful spirit. Years later, Sega Corp actually came to that area and built a building right over her ditch, aka her grave. And as the Sega Corporation was creating games, Sarah basically imprinted her spirit onto one of those game discs. And as this game was being sold and passed between different people, Sarah was able to come back into the world and actually hunt down her friends. The next character on our list is going to be a less well-known version of Sonic, and that's going to be Skinwalker.exe. So this version of Sonic was created by ScorchVX, and on the outside, he looks like Sonic, just with a lighter shade of fur. But that is where the name Skinwalker actually comes into play. For those of you who don't know, many cultures have legends that include skinwalkers or concepts that are similar to them. The most common legend comes from the Navajo culture, where skinwalker is basically described as being a type of a witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as a type of animal. Now, what I find interesting here is that the creator put a very different spin on this legend, and the backstory will help you understand it. Now, the backstory actually takes place in an unofficial port of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and while Sonic was actually fighting against Dr. Eggman alone at Angel Island. Some of you may also know this island as the Floating Island. It's a pretty important location in the Sonic series. A fun fact about this island is that it's actually the home of Knuckles, who is the guardian of the Master Emerald, and that's the emerald that basically allows this island to float. Now, while Sonic and Eggman were actually fighting, Eggman ended up hitting Sonic so hard that he was able to knock him off the island. And this is when Sonic is actually attacked by the Skinwalker virus. It literally consumed him from the inside, leaving a hollow husk, or aka a vessel, for the Skinwalker virus to take control of. Now, from the description of this virus, it sounds like a much more severe version of the flesh-eating viruses that we have in real life. But to make matters even worse is that this virus is actually intelligent and it can mimic people. Some of you may be too young to remember this movie, but this is very reminiscent of an old horror movie called The Thing. Put down in the comments if you actually remember the movie that I'm talking about. Now, having Sonic actually wasn't enough. The virus was still seeking out and trying to feed off other victims in order to spread this virus even further, because apparently it can make a type of hive mind. meaning that each person that is affected is basically connected, which in all honesty makes this virus very hard to fight against. A sad part about this story is that once Sonic's friends actually realize that he's gone missing, they set up a search party to actually go out and look for him. But it seemed that the Skinwalker set up a trap for the friends and ended up adding them into his hive mind. Now we don't know exactly who was captured because the story still isn't fully fleshed out, but I have a sad feeling that Tails is probably one of them because he definitely would have been brave enough to go looking for Sonic. The next character on our list is Slash, and this is another original EXE character that was created by Mars Starbro. And now there isn't a whole lot known about this character, but what I find interesting is that he does have 4 arms, kind of like Fatal Error. And there's one quote that was revealed from him where he basically says, "Let's see who really is a god." I thought this was interesting because we know that Sonic.exe always says that he is God. So it makes me wonder if this character is meant to contend or actually fight against Sonic.exe at some point. The next character on our list is going to be Hog/Scorch, and this character is actually an EXE that was created by Jack Gore, and he's basically supposed to be a bootleg copy of Sonic. Some interesting facts about Hog is that he doesn't actually have a creepypasta in which he comes from. He was an EXE that was made specifically for Friday Night Funkin'. Now the most interesting thing about Hog and Scorch is that technically they are different characters, but they share the same body. The most simple way I can wrap my mind around this is thinking about the Banner and the Hulk. They are obviously different characters, but they both reside in the same body. And while Hog is kind of cute sitting at only 3 feet tall, Scorch looks like a monstrous werewolf standing at 13 feet tall, meaning that this character is huge. The next character on our list to talk about is going to be Curse. Now, the first thing to note is that Curse is technically Sonic the Hedgehog, and in his backstory, he lived a pretty normal life just like the regular Sonic, and that is until one day he got caught in a landslide. Sonic was able to survive the landslide, but one of his legs was pretty much ruined. The damage was so bad that Sonic could never be able to run at the same speed that he did before, and if he would even attempt that type of speed, he would basically make it to where he could never use his leg again, meaning that he can't even walk. And I think this may be part of the reason that we see Curse with the bandages around his legs. At first I thought he was supposed to be like Boom Sonic, but now that I know the backstory, it makes a lot more sense. To make matters worse, Knuckles was with him when this landslide happened, and Knuckles did not make it out alive. Once the public and even some of Sonic's friends found out about this, they blamed Sonic for the death of Knuckles. The most surprising of these people was Tails, because Tails was always like Sonic's right-hand man. But Tails starts to harass Sonic, bully Sonic, and even stalk Sonic so that he will never forget that he's the reason that Knuckles is no longer alive. And just to make it clear, it wasn't Sonic's fault that the landslide happened, so obviously it wasn't his fault that Knuckles is not alive. Another surprising fact about this is that Sonic finds an unlikely ally in this universe in Dr. Eggman. Seeing that Sonic is getting so much hate, Dr. Eggman actually retires from being a criminal and decides to use the rest of his life and his money to help Sonic live more comfortably. He basically uses all his badniks and Metal Sonic to help make sure that Sonic is safe, and he also sends them out to kind of take Sonic's place and help out society as a whole, since now obviously Sonic can't be the hero that he was. Now to make matters even worse, at this point Sonic is inflicted with something called the Curse of X, and what this curse basically does is unalives people that are close to Sonic. Now Sonic tries to hide away from the world, living with his friend Sally, and of course being protected by Dr. Robotnik, but eventually the curse catches up to him and ends up taking the life of Sally, which of course was traumatizing to Sonic because Sally was one of his best friends. The next person to be taken out after that of course was Dr. Eggman, which was another blow because this man basically changed his whole life and his evil ways to try to help Sonic in his time of need. In the end, Metal Sonic and Curse were able to get together and get Dr. Eggman's portal gun to open up a multi-dimensional portal that Sonic could go into to try to escape all the people that hated him and possibly the curse. The sad part here though is that it seems that no matter where he goes, this curse is now a part of him, which makes sense considering that his name is Curse. One thing that I find kind of inspiring about Curse though is that even though he has this horrific life, he is still very friendly and he's always kind of a ray of sunshine to other people, especially when you compare him to any other EXE character. The next character on our list is going to be Santanos, and my Spanish speaking people can probably help me out here, but I'm pretty sure his name translates out to Satan. And if that wasn't enough, he literally has a pentagram on his stomach, and we all know that the pentagram has been connected with things of demonic natures for a long time, even if that's not the original purpose of it. Something else that I find interesting about this character is that he's very reminiscent of Sonic.exe, But one notable difference is what he does with his eyes. In his right pose, up pose, down pose, you see these black tendrils start to go around his eyes, and I think that is an awesome little detail there, and it's just creepy as heck. The next character that we'll talk about is going to be No More Innocence Sonic. Now, even though this character's name is No More Innocence, we're just going to call him Innocence for short. And Innocence is actually a Japanese spirit that feeds off the happiness of children. The children that he feeds on the most are children who are fans of Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, the good news here is that he doesn't actually eat the children. He just eats that happy feeling that they get when they're playing Sonic the Hedgehog. The bad news here, though, is that he also makes the children even more addicted to the video game. So basically, he takes kids who are already playing this game a lot and he makes it to where the game is kind of like a drug. And if the kids don't actually play the game, it's almost as if they go through a physical type of pain. The game is no longer something that they do in their free time or just for pleasure. It becomes something that they have to do. So while Innocence may not be as dangerous as some of the other characters that we've covered on the channel, he is definitely anything but innocent. Whenever he finds himself in a new home, he has nothing but ill intent and malice towards the children that also reside in that home. Now, the backstory for how people actually found out about Innocence is kind of interesting. Basically, when Sonic the Hedgehog 2 came out in Japan, there were a bunch of reports about these fake cartridges that were also being picked up by children. When you actually put the game in, it was obvious that they were just mediocre copies of Sonic the Hedgehog. If you look at Innocence, you can obviously tell that he doesn't look anything like Sonic. But the thing that was frightening is that when people actually came into contact with the game, even if they just touched it, they would start to display some pretty bad symptoms such as intense headaches. They would also start to lose their eyesight and start to have these weird stomach aches. And the worst symptom was that some kids, especially after they had played the game for about a week, they suddenly started losing the ability to walk or even stand up. And now that we know how Innocence works, we can probably understand that the reason that he takes away their ability to walk is so that they'll have to sit in bed and play that game even more. The sad part here is that most of these kids are too young to even understand that anything is wrong, so they tell their parents that they're fine and all they want to do is continue playing this game, having no idea that this evil spirit is basically compelling them to play. Something that I actually find terrifying about Innocence is once parents started figuring out that something was wrong with their children and trying to reach out for help, Innocence had basically already infiltrated the entire home, meaning that he wasn't just affecting the children but also the adults. And he basically affects adults by making sure that they don't get proper rest, and also he keeps them from making like coherent thoughts and sentences. And I know for some people they may think that not being able to sleep really isn't a big deal, but if a person doesn't get proper rest, especially day after day after day, it's basically like they're sleepwalking when they're fully awake. It kind of turns them into like a zombie of a person. So even if people were able to call the police and try to get help, they couldn't actually communicate what was going on. And even people who were able to make coherent thoughts, in the background of their calls when they were trying to get help, there would be this demonic voice speaking over them, so people couldn't actually hear them anyway. And people who would try to come and help those families usually ended up getting affected as well, and then the cycle starts all over again, making this guy surprisingly dangerous. Some interesting facts about Innocence is that even though he's kind of like a poltergeist or a ghost, meaning that he can like move through different electronics in the home and even like move outside of the television, kind of like that girl from The Ring, he can't actually be hurt when he comes into the physical world. And considering the fact that it takes a long time for his abilities to actually become dangerous, if he slips up, he can actually be harmed and even defeated. And this is very possible because while he is very intelligent, he's also very cocky and he believes himself to be invincible when that is definitely not the case. A lot of people are wondering why in the actual mod, Tails is actually battling against Innocence, and it's because this is supposed to be based off Sonic 2. And if you remember in Sonic 2, Tails was basically programmed to follow Sonic around. So this version of Sonic that is trapped in this Sonic 2 bootleg is basically forced to follow this version of Sonic forever. And it seems that Tails is crying and kind of pointing at him because he's trying to warn people that, hey, this is a fake Sonic, you're in danger. Because even though this is obviously a fake Sonic, the Tails that is trapped here with him is the real deal. Meaning that he still has this kind heart and that heroic type of persona, so he's actually trying to save as many people as he can. And it's actually a little sad that how in a lot of these alternate universes, Tails usually gets the short end of the stick, even though he's such a good character. If you enjoyed this video, check out this video on the screen here, subscribe today to become a member of the Orseofkorse, and we'll see you tomorrow with another one. Peace, peace.